Welcome to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. U.S. stocks fall amid increasing concerns about a resurgence in COVID-19 cases around the world. Infections on the rise in China, in Brazil, Iran, saying it may need to go back into lockdown. And Texas reporting a surge in hospitalizations as well. Trading volume also dropped about the time summaries of former National Security Advisor John Bolton's book hit the press. The Trump administration now suing to prevent that book from being published. Meantime, Facebook is making a big change to its ad business, announcing it will start allowing people to opt out of seeing political ads on both Facebook and Instagram. Users will also be able to mute electoral ads and ads on social issues as well. For more, I want to bring in Precision Strategies founding partner Teddy Goff, who before that was President Obama's re-election campaign's digital director. Teddy, good to have you back here on the show. Facebook has already made the controversial decision to not fact-check political ads, not fact-check speech from politicians. What's your take on this now sort of middle ground, saying, well, you can turn off political ads if you don't want to see them?
Well, thanks for having me, Emily. I think the truth is it's not much of a middle ground. What it's doing is putting the onus on the user to do the work. They're saying we won't provide any fact checking or really almost any standards whatsoever on our platform, but you, the user, can click on a few buttons and opt out if you make that decision. The thing I think is really key here is that advertising is a relatively small fraction of the content that a person encounters on Facebook or on Instagram, or for that matter on Twitter, in a given session. And they've made very clear they have no intention of doing anything about disinformation or hate speech or targeted abuse on the organic content that's shared, that again represents the vast majority of what you're going to see every time you go to Facebook. So, this is them saying, we're not doing anything about disinformation. If you don't like ads from politicians, whether or not they're truthful, you can opt out. But there's nothing preventing you from getting a piece of disinformation shared to you from a friend or a neighbor. So the core problem with the platform sort of persists.
Interesting to note, this announcement about political ads was kind of a footnote at the end of an op-ed in USA Today written by Mark Zuckerberg, where they were announcing a new voter registration campaign. Zuckerberg writing, for those of you who've already made up your minds and just want the election to be over, we hear you. So we're introducing the ability to turn off seeing political ads, and we will still remind you to vote. Facebook, Zuckerberg saying their goal with this new voting information campaign is to get 4 million people registered to vote. I wonder, that's great, but are they missing the real problem?
Yeah, totally. I mean, look, I like you just sort of hinted at, I'm glad they're going to register voters. I hope they register 4 million and more. And I hope they do voting reminders and let people know how to vote. And this is an election in which a lot of people may wind up having to vote by mail, many for the first time because of COVID. So I really hope that they contribute constructively to letting people know how to do that, what the deadlines are, if you need to pay for your own postage or not, all that kind of stuff, which can have a really big impact on whether people actually do it or not. But again, I think, advertising is just a relatively small piece of the overall Facebook ecosystem. So they're letting you say, I don't want to hear from Donald Trump, I don't want to hear from Joe Biden, but they're doing nothing about the things that you're going to hear organically from your friends, your family, your neighbors. They're also, I think it's important to note, doing nothing about all the other actors in the political ecosystem who aren't actually campaigns or interest groups. So for example, Breitbart is obviously a quite notorious news website or right-wing news website. They are not classified as a political group, so they could still advertise something into your feed. So it essentially changes the makeup of the political content that a person is going to receive on Facebook or on Instagram. It doesn't necessarily do anything about information. In fact, disinformation. It probably doesn't do anything about disinformation. It just allows a few users to say, I want to hear less from candidates themselves. But I think it's a problem for the democracy, a problem for the whole political discourse. If a truthful ad from Joe Biden, a person can opt out of that, but a piece of disinformation from some crazy uncle, a person can't opt out of that. You run the risk that you're actually worsening the overall mix of information and disinformation that a person receives on Facebook or on Instagram.
Interesting. Now, as a person who ran the digital side of President Obama's reelection campaign, you know how important a platform like Facebook is. I mean, do you think this will materially impact the ability for President Trump, Vice President Joe Biden to reach voters for this election?
Yeah, yes is the answer. I think it's a little, it's going to be interesting to see how many people actually use this. If you look at Facebook, put out a blog post late last night where they explained how you actually go through the process of opting out. It's not the most intuitive thing in the world. It's a couple of clicks. It's not, as I understand it, going to be a big banner that says opt out. So you kind of have to find the button, click, get a menu of options, click again. My guess is that not all that many people avail themselves of it. It matters who does, though. I was talking to a friend earlier who said, the kinds of people that campaigns desperately need to reach are the kinds of people who are often most fed up with politics. And so, if it is the case that the undecided voter or perhaps the sort of demobilized voter who either campaign is going to try to be reaching, if it's the case that they're the ones who are most likely to use this tool, then that's a big deal for campaigns in both parties. The other thing I think is really important to note, we're also obsessed with the White House, and understandably so, given the person who's in it. But this doesn't just affect Donald Trump and Joe Biden. This affects people running for state house. This affects people running for dog catcher. This affects people running for mayor. This could affect local interest groups that are trying to do something, good in their community. And essentially, I think what it's going to do is sort of hamstring anybody who doesn't already have an audience. Donald Trump is going to probably be just fine on Facebook. He's got tens of millions of followers. He's got huge organic reach, and he's obviously got a whole disinformation network supporting him from both the United States and abroad. If you're someone who is inspired by the protests or fed up with the government's handling of COVID-19 or something like that, and you're trying to get something, start something new and either run for office or start some policy initiative, a Facebook ad is a huge part of the way that you would grow an audience and get traction. And this is going to affect them too. So I think it's worth noting this isn't just about the big guys. And in some sense, I think this is going to have its biggest effect on the little guys, the people who really need to have every tool at their disposal as they think about how to grow.
Speaking of the big guys, though, I mean, this could be the most critical election in our lifetime if it wasn't the last presidential election. And I'm curious what your thoughts are now on how President Trump, how Biden, continue to reach voters and have their campaigns make an impact. I mean, obviously, we're just seeing so much of Trump right now. And President Biden, Vice President Biden, hasn't been breaking through. What are the chances that he can break through, especially given all of these changes continuing to happen in the digital ecosystem?
I think one of the many problems with the digital ecosystem that we have right now is that it gives an advantage to whoever is the most incendiary, whoever is the most emotional, whoever is the most, sort of provocative. People pay attention to Donald Trump's tweets because they're, in my opinion, nutty, and you pay attention to something nutty in the same way that you pay attention to a car crash as you drive by it. And it's very difficult for people who are urging a certain sense of moderation, people who are urging continuity, people who are urging things like kindness and dignity and empathy. Those are not the sort of grabbiest messages, the grabbiest emotions out there. And the dynamic that we have here in the States is reflected in country after country after country after country. This is something I've said many times. People say that Donald Trump, won the internet. They also say that Modi wins the internet in India, and they say that Duterte wins the internet in the Philippines, and they say that Bolsonaro wins the internet in Brazil. All of these people who happen to be far right, autocratic types, but it could happen on the far left too, are people who sort of had a posture of insurgency against an entrenched elite, and were peddling a message that that appeals to people on Facebook when they can't find it in their local newspaper or their equivalent of cable news, because it's not one that they've heard before. And so I think the problem for Biden, coming back to the United States, is he's not saying a lot of stuff that is shocking. He's not saying a lot of stuff that is hugely incendiary. He's saying a lot of stuff that, I'm a Democrat, but he's saying a lot of stuff that is, that is true and common sense and appealing, but in less of a riveting way than a president who says things that you can't believe the US president is saying. And that's a structural problem that's going to keep him at a disadvantage on Facebook, a disadvantage on Twitter, a disadvantage on YouTube, a disadvantage on all these platforms. And it doesn't have all that much to do with advertising. It has to do with the core mechanics of how the algorithms promote content that's more clicky, that's more engaging, that people share more. And that's a real advantage. Now I think the Biden campaign doesn't need to doesn't need to be in despair about this, because their objective is not to,
Right.
get more Twitter followers than Donald Trump or to get more retweets than Donald Trump. They're out there to win an election. I think the internet realistically is going to continue to be more of an obstacle than a benefit to them. But, that's one they've got to overcome. And I think there are other paths to the White House than just the retweet path that Donald Trump took a few years ago.
All right. Well, Teddy, always interesting to get your thoughts on these issues. Teddy Goff, former digital director of President Obama's reelection campaign. Thank you so much for stopping by today. All right, coming up after Uber and Lyft, San Francisco is coming for DoorDash in a new lawsuit. I'll speak to the San Francisco district attorney about that coming up. This is Bloomberg. All right, U.S. stocks falling for the first time in 4 days after increasing concerns about rising COVID-19 cases around the world, overtaking the optimism about the economy reopening and federal stimulus. I want to bring in Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle, who's been following all of the market moves. Abigail, break it down for us.
Jittery day, Emily, and a different result than yesterday, because yesterday there were virus concerns as well. But at the end of the day, stocks pulled past those worries and finished sharply higher. Today, not so much. Stocks never really got out of their own way. The S&P 500 opened up about 0.5%. And then mid-morning, news around Texas hospitalizations surged. That sent stocks lower, then fluctuating. At the end of the day, though, mainly lower. The NASDAQ 100, though, tech was the one outperformer from a sector standpoint, or one of two, I believe. So the NASDAQ 100 gaining, but the Russell 2000, a more domestically oriented index, really underperforming, highlighting those concerns around the virus, down 1.8%. Plus, there was a bid for bonds, and there was also a bid for the haven yen overall. So a risk-off tone, and something to pay attention to. Typically, we don't talk about the Dow transports, Emily, but over the last number of days, there's been a real bull-bear battle in all of the major averages, and the Dow transports led on the way down back in January around virus concerns, because transportation of goods and services really so sensitive to the virus. Over the last 5 days, that index really underperforming, telling you that investors are very concerned about the virus and what it could do for the economy, even if there's never a true shutdown once again.
Interesting. Talk to us about what happened in tech stocks, specifically chips.
Chips outperformed. That was a nice bright spot. At the highs, the stocks had been up nearly 2%, and this is on 5G hopes. Qualcomm really getting a good boost today, saying that cheaper phones might see 5G chips faster than 4G had happened. At the end of the year, their Snapdragon chip will be in some of those cheaper phones. But the gains are really giving up. At the end of the day, the stock's up just 1%. And interesting, and one reason the majors were down, Apple down slightly on the day, and that's also, of course, sensitive to 5G. I'm sure we'll be talking about Apple again soon, Emily. It's hard not to do. But chips, that was one bright spot in an otherwise neutral to risk-off day.
Okay, Abigail Doolittle for us in New York. Abigail, thanks so much for breaking it down. Well, while a lawsuit in California against Uber and Lyft for misclassifying their drivers as gig workers is still in order, San Francisco is now coming for DoorDash. But why DoorDash specifically? Earlier, I spoke with San Francisco District Attorney Chase Aboudin about a new lawsuit filed against DoorDash. Take a listen.
We understand that often the crimes that impact the most people and do the most damage to public trust and public safety are crimes that most district attorneys' offices don't investigate or pursue at all. Crimes like misclassifying workers or wage theft on a massive scale, which is exactly what our lawsuit alleges DoorDash has been doing for years. We know that in order to keep the public safe and in order to build trust in the criminal justice system, we have to start enforcing the laws equally. It's not enough to simply prosecute people arrested on street corners. We need to also make sure who are investigating crimes committed in corporate boardrooms.
This is based on a controversial law that went into effect in January, ruling that workers like delivery drivers should be considered employees, and it's on the companies to prove otherwise. What exactly do you think DoorDash is doing wrong?
Well, let me just say, I don't view the law as controversial. We've had all three branches of California government speak to it. I understand there's opposition within some tech companies, but the reality is the California Supreme Court has ruled on the issue. The California legislature has codified the Supreme Court ruling, and the governor has spoken to the issue as well. The allegation is that DoorDash is systematically and intentionally misclassifying its employees as independent contractors. And it's doing so in order to avoid fairly competing with other companies and in order to avoid complying with laws that protect workers and require paying into state unemployment and workers' compensation funds.
So what about Uber? What about Lyft? What about Instacart? All of these companies fall under a similar umbrella. Will you be taking action against them too?
We're certainly not going to limit our economic crimes against workers unit, which I created a few weeks ago, to one lawsuit.
So are you actively working or pursuing cases against those companies as well?
My colleagues in the Attorney General's office and a number of city attorneys' offices filed a similar lawsuit against Uber and Lyft a couple weeks ago. I do expect that whether it's from my office or from other government agencies around the state, that some of the other companies you list will be required to comply with the law that defines and determines who is an employee and who is an independent contractor. I think we've seen a number of these companies engage in flagrant violations, much to the detriment of their employees, the public as a whole, and the state of California.
Now, in a response, DoorDash gave us this statement saying, today's action seeks to disrupt the essential services Dashers provide, stripping hundreds of thousands of students, teachers, parents, retirees, and other Californians of valuable work opportunities, depriving local restaurants of desperately needed revenue and making it more difficult for consumers to receive prepared food, groceries, and other essentials safely and reliably. What's your response to that?
It simply misstates the core issue, which is DoorDash's refusal to abide by the law and to pay its fair share. It's unfair to other companies that follow the law. It's unfair to employees who have, in many instances, been paid less than minimum wage and given no benefits that the law requires. And it's unfair to the taxpayers of California who are left footing the bill when we have massive surges in unemployment and there's no money in our state unemployment fund because companies like DoorDash have illegally refused to contribute their fair share.
Now, you're saying these workers deserve minimum wage, overtime, sick leave, other protections, even restitution. What would DoorDash, in your view, have to do to make this right? I mean, are you talking about years of back pay?
Well, the statute provides remedies that are quite clear, and we lay them out in detail in the complaint we filed in court yesterday. I believe the statute contemplates $2,500 in penalties per violation, which can be doubled in some instances if the violation is against an employee who is disabled or in some other protected class.
DoorDash has been fighting this law along with some of these other companies. If the law is overturned, what about that?
Assembly Bill 5 is the law at issue and under which our lawsuit falls. Let's be very clear about a couple things. DoorDash, Uber, Lyft, other companies are very welcome to engage in lobbying and the legislative process to change the law if they disagree with it. What they cannot do and will not be allowed to do on my watch is flagrantly violate the law as it exists.
Have you been talking to workers? I'm curious what they're telling you.
Yes, we've gotten a lot of feedback, overwhelmingly supportive. Many people have reached out over social media and other means, urging us to expand the lawsuit to include some of the other companies you mentioned. People feel that it's outrageous that they've had the tips given to them garnished by their employer, that they've been mistreated, that they've been forced to sign contracts of adhesion, and that they've been basically working in conditions that make it impossible for them to get the full benefits of being an employee.
Now, some other things your office is doing with tech companies, you're partnering with Airbnb and Lyft to fight domestic violence. I'd love to hear about other issues, other potential cases that you're exploring as it pertains to the tech community.
Absolutely. Well, look, San Francisco is and long has been home to the tech industry. It's a great part of this city's economy and workforce and our cultural identity. We're eager to work with all those companies that contribute to the city and that follow the law. I'm really excited about our partnership with Airbnb that provides no-cost housing in emergency circumstances to victims of domestic violence, or our partnership with Lyft that allows victims of sexual assault to get free transportation to a hospital where they can have a rape kit collected. Those kinds of partnerships promote public safety, just as our lawsuit against DoorDash does as well.
San Francisco District Attorney there, Chesa Boudin, will continue to follow developments in that case. Moving on now to a Bloomberg scoop. The founder of the electric trucking company Nikola exaggerated the capabilities of the debut truck. Our Ed Ludlow broke this story and joins us now. Ed, what can you tell us about what happened here?
So on December the 1st, 2016, in Salt Lake City, Trevor Milton, who is Nikola's founder and now executive chairman, unveiled the Nikola One, the company's first prototype truck, and it was displayed as a hydrogen fuel cell EV. And at the time, he told the audience that they had to chain the truck down to stop it being driven off by, people in case they drove it off the stage. He said that it was not a pusher, which is industry parlance for basically meaning a prototype that cannot operate under its own power. It needed to be pushed onto the stage. What sources told me is that that's exactly what it was. It was an inoperable prototype, that it had several components missing from it, including the components relating to the motor, the gears, and the fuel cell at the heart of the hydrogen system. There was no fuel cell in it, according to sources. And so it was, essentially immovable, as sources describe it. And I guess it's important to add that Trevor Milton, when I spoke to him this morning, pushed back against that, saying that he had never deceived anyone. But he did, say at that time and in interviews the following day that it was a working operational vehicle.
Right. So how does he explain some of these inconsistencies then? I mean, this is a company that has taken off in part because of how this truck was debuted and is considered, a potential real competitor, or has been considered a potential real competitor to Tesla.
So he says on the fuel cell that there was no fuel cell in that prototype, but he also says that he never said there was a fuel cell within it. There was a last-minute pivot several weeks before the event where they moved from a natural gas system to a hydrogen fuel cell system. But he says he never actually stated that there was a fuel cell inside that prototype. He said that the components that I mentioned that we believe to be missing were removed on purpose for safety reasons. The other thing that he said was, at the time of the event, was that they had tested it. And he recently told us at Bloomberg that it had been tested. When I spoke to him this morning, he said that they had tested it with these components missing and without power. They basically let it roll down an incline with those pieces missing. And his explanation for that was also safety, that by removing the motor and removing the gears, the truck essentially could not run away and therefore hurt anyone. But yeah, so that's kind of how he sums the situation.
So what does Nikola actually then plan to do? What's next?
So Nikola's got different stages of goals. The first is to build a battery electric semi-truck, which it's doing as a joint venture with CNH Industrial Iveco in Germany, and a plant in Germany which is already built, and that will be a sort of cooperation with another company. At the same time, they're looking to build a factory in Arizona, about 30 miles south of Phoenix, where they will eventually build a hydrogen fuel cell semi-truck, but that is much further into the distance. They're not expecting to make any serious revenue on any of these products until around 2023. So these are sort of more realistic goals. But the big umbrella point that a lot of people are picking up on is that Nikola wants to develop a hydrogen network that it can use to fuel these hydrogen fuel cell trucks. If you imagine, just as you go to the gas station to get gas for your car, they want to have a broad network across the United States and beyond of hydrogen stations that will make the logistics of filling up these trucks and the economic viability of that system more realistic, as they put it.
All right, Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow, thank you so much for bringing us that scoop. We'll continue to follow. Coming up, our continued coverage of the challenges facing Black CEOs in Silicon Valley, people in a position of power that sometimes feel powerless. We'll discuss with the CEO of LucidWorks next. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. Protests over the recent deaths of George Floyd and Rayshard Brooks have triggered a national conversation about race. Tech companies and venture capitalists have joined in with messages of solidarity and committing some $300 million to investments towards minority groups who are significantly underrepresented in Silicon Valley. But how much of this action will create real change? Joining us to discuss, the CEO of LucidWorks, which builds AI-powered search products, Will Hayes, with us now. Will, thank you so much for joining us. You know, you've been working in Silicon Valley for 20 years, and I know you've had a lot of different kinds of experiences, and I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share some of those experiences with us, especially when there have been times that you believe you've encountered either subtle or even overt racism.
Yeah, I mean, I think first off, just biased and sort of just racial experiences are just part of the experience and the culture that we live in. Silicon Valley is with, you know, its own particular set of challenges. You know, for me, for somebody first who grew up in the Bay Area, grew up amongst the diversity and the cultural richness of the Bay Area. You know, obviously the context switch into my professional life and technology, though local, was quite jarring. Just the lack of diversity. There's sort of this myth of meritocracy, if you will, that tends to kind of limit the scope of individuals and their backgrounds. And so, you know, coming up in this environment right out of high school was when I started working in the Silicon Valley. It was very clear to me that not only, you know, was I different in terms of the way that I looked, but there was not a very organic extension of sort of the Bay Area childhood experience and growing up into these large sort of experiences and wealth creation and opportunities that the Silicon Valley has created in the Bay Area. So the disconnect from the community that's here being displaced and what's being created is where I see the biggest divide and the biggest gap. And that translates to race and culture very quickly, just given how culturally rich the Bay Area is historically.
It's a myth of meritocracy, indeed. I mean, as I understand it, you have been confused with your deputy, who's white, on numerous occasions, and at a certain point, both of you realized this is not a coincidence. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these experiences that, you know, when you're raising money for a company, it's hard. Building startups is hard. So you're dealing with adversity every single day just to try to keep operations going, go to market, capital. These are all challenges. The added challenge of that I faced, and I think a lot of minorities and especially Black founders and CEOs in this valley, is just sort of the way that we've built up sort of venture capital around what's called pattern matching. There's a certain expectation of background, of network, and it's often jarring when those things don't fit. And so typically what would happen, and not just myself, but a number of Black leaders have experienced this, you walk into a room, the immediate reaction would be to go to my white colleague and say, "Hey, Will, nice to meet you, very excited to meet." It's not just that mistake. Look, I can forgive a mistake. And in fact, when you get into the mode of entrepreneurism, you're just so tunnel visioned in your success that you tend to ignore these things. But it was the disadvantage that then that would create, the uncomfortableness in the room. I could see the person just sort of reeling in their head. They can't believe they made this mistake. They feel terrible. The optics of it must be terrible. And now they're distracted effectively from what we're here to talk about, which is why we believe that we're building an amazing company and why we want to partner with, you know, the firm in question to continue that journey. So you create this disadvantage out of the gate. And it's one that is often just fueled by sort of guilt and a sense of just, you know, sorrow that they made the mistake. But from my perspective, it's like, now we've got this additional hurdle in what is already a very difficult process that we need to overcome. And so that creates that sort of unconscious bias or microaggression, which just creates a harder situation for people that may not fit the more traditional mold.
Now, I've talked to so many women who've tried to change who they are to avoid issues of sexism. For example, you know, putting their hair up before a meeting with investors, not getting their nails done, maybe bringing a man to the meeting so they can be taken more seriously. Have you done anything similar like that over the years, or felt that you had to change who you are in order to get what you need or want?
It's a, it's a heavy question. I mean, my entire career has been one of just never feeling entirely comfortable with myself. I mean, I was 18 years old when I started working, so I was already young. Again, I grew up in an area where not a lot of people had exposure to professional settings, so that was uncomfortable. And then just to add sort of race to that context, understanding that I was sort of what you would call unrepresented. What really hit me, and that was kind of throughout my career as I came up, as I became an executive and more importantly, a CEO of a company and having to raise money and invest or engage with investors, what I found was that that hurdle just created another set of adversity and another thing that we had to go clear. And there were times, and I don't say this proudly, but there were definitely times when you're in that tunnel vision, when all you want is to get this thing right and to continue to pursue that vision, where you ask yourself, like, what do I have to do to be different? Do I need to find another CEO? Do I need to find another founder? And so there's definitely those moments, and they're painful. But it's part of just, I think we all go through some sense of sort of identity crisis as you go through these experiences. And all entrepreneurs and all founders face it. I think entrepreneurs and founders of color, there's always this what if question. What if I look different? Would this be easier? Am I creating a disadvantage for the people that I care about, which is the team that I've built, that they have invested their time in this vision? They believe in me. They believe in what we're doing. I don't want to let these people down. So I think it's completely natural to have those feelings. I can say personally, I've gotten a lot more comfortable as I've gotten older in terms of who I am and where I come from and the culture and the music and the things that represent me. But it was definitely a process for me to kind of get to that point. And it's not to say that I don't have moments where I digress a little bit, but just really trying to kind of stay true to myself and understand that that confidence comes from experience, not from somebody else's perception of me based on how I look.
Now, so many conversations are happening right now inside companies about how to address this. What are we doing wrong? Clearly, there's a real problem, and we are not handling this correctly. Do you think that what we're seeing right now, these new commitments, whether it's money, whether it's messages of solidarity, is this the time when we're actually and finally going to start to see real change, or are you skeptical?
A lot of people are asking me that right now. I will say that I'm cautiously optimistic. The situations that we're discussing, and not just in tech, but just in the world in general, these aren't new. I was very disturbed after the Floyd incident, and people were coming to me saying, we need a statement. My first feeling was like, well, why do you all of a sudden you need a statement? Nobody ever wanted a statement from me. Police violence, racial injustice, these aren't things that are new to me in my life. But immediately, all of a sudden, it's okay to talk about. So that was a little bit, I had to kind of adjust to that expectation and get comfortable with it. I will say one thing right now that makes me most optimistic. People are listening. And the difference is we've never seen change. Change can never happen when we're defensive, when we're trying to rationalize, when we're trying to tell somebody else's story. The number of people that are simply listening today and playing back what they hear, that encourages me. The diversity of people who are speaking up, we got everybody from the Roger Goodells of the world to the tech leaders. This is different. So because of that energy, I feel way more optimistic about what's possible. But I recognize that this is not a new topic and it's not something that can be fixed overnight. But when we're listening, when we're curious, when we're listening to the shared experiences of others, rather than trying to go write their story for them, that's when we make progress. I see this in my company every day, less charged topics when we're talking about go-to-market and product roadmaps. But again, listening is what creates change. When we're defensive, I call it below the line, that's when we just resist and we continue to perpetuate. And I think we've been very defensive around the conversation, particularly the phrase Black Lives Matter for the last 10 years. And there's been a shift in sort of the overall echo chamber that is very positive for me. But again, for a lot of us, especially those of us who have kind of been on the forefront of this for a long time, we've sort of heard these conversations before. We have not necessarily seen the level of change that one would expect. And so that's where the skepticism comes from. But again, the listening has me optimistic.
Now, I want to talk about how important these conversations are from a product perspective. Lucidworks makes AI-powered search solutions. The people who are making the products that we all use on a daily basis, it's important that people of all backgrounds are making those products because it impacts the results. Talk to us about how, what you're doing inside the company and how important you believe it is to make sure the people who are developing, artificial intelligence, the artificial intelligence that powers search, come from a variety of backgrounds to make sure that you get the product right.
You absolutely got it. I mean, I think AI, there is such an opportunity to do this well, and there is a ton of opportunities to make mistakes. And the first thing is going to be, are we representative in the way we're thinking about the experiences? We provide what's called AI-powered search. That means that we help drive search results that are personal to you. We provide recommendations. We let brands and companies like REI to Morgan Stanley determine how they want to craft that journey for you. One thing that we're fortunate of is the scope of what we impact is typically very specific to the brand that you're experiencing. So this is different than companies that are trying to build things like Siri or Facebook or broad reaching AI that's supposed to adapt to language and ignore things like cultural biases. And so ensuring that you have representation in the way that you train these models is key. From a LucidWorks standpoint, we look at our customers first and we try to understand their objectives. There's always an objective. I want my employees to be more productive. I want my customers to spend more money with me. And we try to optimize for those objectives. Very little cultural dimensions come into the work that we do, except for now we're going into voice. And voice is a really fascinating topic when it comes to how we identify ourselves, the way that we communicate. And you run the risk as a technology company of not having representation of the broader cultural elements that are going to be inputting into those experiences. And so we need to ensure that we are staffing appropriately, that we are testing appropriately, and we're getting a very broad range of backgrounds and cultures and folks to input into these efforts that we're doing to ensure that we do not create that unintentional bias, which is, it bites companies all the time. We saw this with Microsoft with their chatbot. We see this on Twitter all the time. We cannot simply just rely on the internet to provide the input to put together a productive experience. It has to be intentional from the organization to ensure biases doesn't show up inside of their AI models in particular.
Right. So important, given that this technology is going to be influencing our lives for decades to come. Will, thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
Thank you. Great being here.
So appreciate your energy and the fact that you got so personal. Will Hayes, CEO of LucidWorks. Great to have you today on the show. All right, coming up, Apple under renewed attack in the EU over antitrust concerns. Our own Mark Gurman will be with us next. This is Bloomberg. Apple is facing a set of probes from the EU's antitrust chief, Margaret Vestager. This as she looks to rewrite the rule book for big tech. Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo has the latest.
The European Commission has launched a probe into Apple that could see the American tech company handed out yet another fine by EU regulators. This time, the European Commission, led by Margaret Vestager, who was described by President Trump as, quote, Europe's tax lady that doesn't like us very much, is looking into the Apple Pay and the Apple Store systems. And Europeans want to figure out whether or not Apple abused its dominant position in the market in detriment to rivals. This is not, however, the first time that Apple runs into problems with the European Commission. It was already handed out a record fine for not paying enough taxes in Europe. And by the way, Apple says that it has always complied with the rules and doesn't agree with none of the probes that have been launched so far by the European Commission. But at this point, this is a story that goes beyond Apple in particular. This really taps into the tension that we're seeing between American tech companies and European regulators. American companies argue that they get treated unfairly by Europeans because they lack the innovation. They have to catch up, and in the meantime, they compete on taxation and antitrust. The Europeans will say this is not entirely accurate. They just want to see this companies operating by the set rules in the EU and pay a fair amount of taxation. Nonetheless, it could trigger an escalation in the trade tensions that we're seeing play out between the United States and Europe. In Brussels, Maria Tadeo, Bloomberg News.
Joining us now to discuss further, we've got Bloomberg's Mark Gurman, who, of course, covers Apple. And Mark, the latest is that you've got developers now piling on, sharing their concerns and complaints about Apple in a similar vein. What are they saying?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the timing couldn't really be worse for Apple, Emily. On Monday, obviously, is the kickoff day for their annual developer conference, basically where they bring a bunch of developers together, of course, online this year, to sell them to write apps for their new software and services. And developers are really pushing back on Apple's, so-called monopolistic tendencies, whereas there are some applications that don't want to use Apple's in-app purchase system, which is basically subscriptions and other upgrades, because if they use Apple's system, they have to give 30% of that to Apple.
Apple, in a statement, has called this European Commission investigation disappointing, saying they're advancing baseless complaints from a handful of companies who simply want a free ride and don't want to play by the same rules as everybody else. We don't think that's right. We want to maintain a level playing field where anyone with determination and a great idea can succeed. What do you make of Apple's response to all of this?
Apple's response specifically to the European Commission, not to some of the U.S.-based app developers complaining about the same thing. And it's essentially the same response they gave when Spotify, led the European Union to probe Apple over antitrust concerns last year. Apple's basically saying that they are the storekeeper. They invest a lot of money in making this happen. Apple feels that without their platform, a lot of these companies won't exist. So that's their position, and I think that is a somewhat fair position. But I also think some of the tactics that Apple uses are quite dated. For example, that 30% fee or cut, which a lot of people call the Apple tax, has existed from 2008. That's 12 years ago. That was well before a lot of these apps and services even existed. This was before things like Spotify, Uber, Postmates, a lot of the complaining services existed. So some of these policies are basically from a different era. And I think a lot of developers agree there needs to be some adjustment here.
Interesting. Apple is also facing antitrust scrutiny in the United States. Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, Sundar Pichai of Alphabet, Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos, all of them have said they will testify. We haven't heard yet from Apple on that. How big a risk is this, scrutiny, not just in Europe, but in the United States as well, to Apple's overall business?
That's a good question. I think that 9 out of 10 situations regarding Apple and antitrust, it's not necessarily an issue, right? They're not the market leader in any particular area for hardware, such as the iPhone, the Mac, the iPad, the Apple Watch, et cetera. So that's not really a problem. The problem is on the App Store, and the concern is that Apple basically has their own services like Apple Music and iCloud that compete with services like, Spotify, Dropbox, email, etc. Apple obviously has no one to give a 30% cut to because they own the store, yet they're taking this 30% cut from those, so-called rivals. And that's really the problem. I personally think there's going to be a change at some point. I think Apple might either reduce its rate, it might allow competing services to open up to rival payment methods. There are ways around this. Is it going to impact Apple long term? Particularly, yes, on the services segment. But I think their hardware revenue is also still so strong. They have other things coming down the pipeline that long term, it's not going to be that significant of a negative impact.
All right, Bloomberg's Mark Gurman there for us as we get one day closer to that Worldwide Developers Conference, which we will, of course, will be covering here on the show. All right, still ahead is TikTok turning a new leaf. The social video app sensation, once accused of downplaying political content, is now embracing Black Lives Matter. Details on that next. This is Bloomberg. TikTok is loosening its grip on political speech tied to the Black Lives Matter movement. The Chinese video app, which has been accused of downplaying political speech and removing posts that didn't fit its image, now making more room for these kinds of videos. Why the change of heart? For more, I want to bring in Bloomberg's Shelley Banjo, who's been covering TikTok for us. So TikTok, Shelley, known for, these catchy memes, these goofy videos, but in recent days has taken a more dramatic turn. Talk to us about this change of heart and what you're seeing.
That's exactly right. Over 10 billion views of videos with the hashtag Black Lives Matter have been seen on the site. And there's just been this kind of outpouring and complete change of tenor of this app. The app has been growing in terms of users and people downloading it to more than 2 billion users or downloads around the world. So part of it is just this maturation of the platform and the fact that there are more older users on the site. Also, the fact that, these protests and the movement has kind of erupted all across in all facets of life that we've seen in all facets of media. But there is a complete kind of change for TikTok in the sense that, this used to be this place of lighthearted content, and clearly this marks a change of what's to come for the platform.
So, talk to us about the ties that TikTok has to China and what in the past they have done when this kind of content has surfaced. I mean, there are some awful stories about TikTok downplaying content from people who are overweight, from people who are disabled. What about that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's what really caught my eye on this story was that I remember last year I was in Hong Kong and covering some of the protests, and there was a lot of accusations that TikTok was suppressing content regarding the Hong Kong protests. And at the time, the spokesman for the company said, well, that video, for example, has a video of police holding guns or tear gas or people crying because they've been hit by tear gas. And so those really violate our guidelines. So, fast forward almost a year later, and you're seeing those same kind of images in the U.S. So the reason why this matters so much and people take it so seriously is because TikTok is part of a huge Chinese company, ByteDance, the world's largest startup by valuation at this point. And they have been subject to a number of investigations, or at least questions being raised by authorities saying, is there a manipulation of content? And part of the reason that the questions arise is that the decisions that TikTok makes, whether to amplify content or to suppress certain content, continue to seem like they dovetail with the priorities of the Chinese government. So that's Hong Kong protests or suppressing videos around concentration camps in Xinjiang or around, like you mentioned, overweight, gay, disabled people.
Now, quickly, will TikTok, or how will TikTok sort of weather the controversies that have been facing Twitter and Facebook, whether or not they take a stand on political content? I mean, do you expect that TikTok, and we have about 30 seconds, Shelley, do you expect that TikTok will face some of those similar issues?
I think they will, and they are already adding tons of staff in Washington, D.C., creating these transparency centers around the world where they want to invite people in to kind of take them behind the algorithm, show them why they make the decisions they have. So I think that the company's definitely preparing for it, and as they get bigger and as they get older, they're kind of readying themselves for that kind of fight.
Okay. All right, Bloomberg Shelley Banjo, thank you so much for that reporting. Something we'll continue to follow. And thank you all for watching this edition of Bloomberg Technology. Bloomberg Daybreak Australia is next. I'm Emily Chang. This is Bloomberg.